On October the 1st, 50 members of the Rwandan Patriotic Front crossed the border from Uganda into Rwanda, killing a customs official and initiating a larger invasion. Since colonial times, there had been tensions between the two primary ethnic groups within Rwanda, the majority Hutu and minority Tutsi peoples. When Rwanda gained its independence, a Tutsi monarchy was in place, but between 1959 and 1962, a wave of ethnic violence swept it away and installed a Hutu-dominated republic instead, with over 300,000 Tutsi fleeing across the border to Uganda. Armed and experienced following participation in Uganda's internal conflicts during the 80s, in October 1990, Fred Rwigema led the newly named Rwandan Patriotic Front back into Rwanda. Things did not go well. He was killed on the second day, and Rwandan government forces pushed the RPF back across the border by the end of October, but it was the beginning of the Rwandan Civil War. And as one civil war began, another ended, as Syrian forces mounted a major operation to finally defeat the Lebanese government of Michel Aoun, which had refused to abide by the previous year's Taif Agreement, which was supposed to have ended the conflict. Syrian troops had initially intervened in the Lebanese Civil War in 1976, shortly after it began, but Aoun's forces were receiving support from Saddam Hussein, and it wasn't until the invasion of Kuwait that his attention and resources were diverted. Other sources also claim that the US permitted Syria to take over Lebanon in exchange for Syrian help in the Gulf crisis. East and West Germany officially reunited on the 3rd of October, with the West German state essentially absorbing the East, but despite the widespread celebrations, 40 years of vastly different economic and social policies would not be easily overcome, and many in the prosperous West were nervous about how the new nation would go about closing the financial gap. Meanwhile, outside Germany, some also had reservations, notably British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who feared that the new nation would be too powerful, destabilising Europe just as the creation of the German Empire in 1871 had. However, the public mood across most of Europe seemed to be more positive. Later in the month, South Africa made a major reform, ending racial segregation in public utilities like libraries, swimming pools and public transport. It was still not yet a full repeal of apartheid, that would require a referendum, but it was definitely a step along the road. On the same day, Mikhail Gorbachev was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to reform the USSR and bring the Cold War to an end. It was the first time the prize ceremony was held at Oslo City Hall, rather than the Nobel Institute or the University of Oslo, and it's been held there ever since. A week after the Spanish Grand Prix, Alessandro Nannini had been visiting his vineyard near Siena by helicopter when it crashed. To quote Auto Week, "The chopper came down tail first, dug into the mud and flipped onto its roof, rotors whirring. Nannini stuck his hands over his head for protection, and as the canopy collapsed, his right arm was severed by the rotors. Nannini remembers wondering how he was ever going to go sailing again, a great passion of his, and then he remembers little else until he woke up in hospital several days later with a reattached arm. The wonders of modern microsurgery had saved his arm, but like Martin Donnelly, it was unknown when or if he would be able to race again." The end of the European season had also seen the end of the Euro Brunn and Life teams, both of which withdrew from the championship rather than make the long, expensive and probably pointless trip to Japan and Australia. They would not be missed by many, and particularly not by the Coloni, AGS and Azella teams, who would now no longer need to pre-qualify. It was a pity for the hard-working employees, though, who would no doubt be hoping to find new berths in the off-season. Roberto Moreno, however, had already been trying to get out of Eurobrunn and was in England talking to Brabham when the vacancy came up, and by chance was at Benetton doing John Barnard a favour by sitting in the mock-up of the 1991 car, so they didn't need to get Nelson or Sandro over just for that. That was the day the news came through, and Barnard recognised that Moreno was in a tight spot and had done him a favour, and despite the phone ringing off the hook from agents and drivers wanting to get the drive, he offered it to Moreno. Lotus, meanwhile, had turned to their test driver, former Benetton driver Johnny Herbert, to replace Martin Donnelly, again for the last two races. Both teams had understandably yet to make a decision on a more permanent replacement, so both Herbert and Moreno would be keen to impress. There was a rumour going round that Benetton were also interested in 1990 IndyCar runner-up Michael Andretti, son and teammate of 1978 champion Mario, as Ford were keen to have an established American name in the car. Minardi had also replaced the misfiring Paolo Barilla with Gianni Morbidelli, who had deputised for Pirro at Scuderia Italia earlier in the season. With Minardi running Ferrari engines next year, the Ferrari test driver was being looked at for a full-time race drive. Car number 12, Johnny Herbert. Hotly tipped for stardom in 1988, many felt that Benetton and Johnny Herbert had made a mistake by rushing him back from injury at the start of the 1989 season, and he was dropped after just 5 races. Retained as Lotus test driver, he headed to Japan, where he took part in one race of the All-Japan Prototype Endurance Series, co-driving a Porsche 926C with Martin Donnelly, and then entered the full series for 1990, as well as driving a Japanese F3000. Neither of them with a great deal of success, but they did keep his skills fresh and built up his fitness, and he was ready to take the call up from Lotus. It would take a brave man to step into a car that had been involved in 2 major accidents in the last 3 races, but particularly for Johnny, who'd had his own nearly career-ending crash in a yellow, fully Camel-sponsored car. And Alex Caffey was back in the Arrows, meaning Bernd Schneider would miss out, at least for now, on being the first driver to represent a united Germany in F1. The Arrows team, for their part, announced at their sponsor's home race that the team would be renamed Footwork next year, with Porsche engines and Alboreto and Caffey driving, following the trend set by Leighton House of buying naming rights to the teams they sponsored. Between Footwork Arrows and Leighton House, Brabham, owned by Middlebridge, now announced to be using Yamaha engines next year, Espoo Larousse, drivers Aguri Suzuki and Satoru Nakajima, and of course the mighty Honda engines, plus the superstar status of Ayrton Senna, the Japanese Grand Prix had plenty of local interest and was, as usual, immensely popular and oversubscribed, with a lottery held to allocate tickets. Ferrari, though, weren't going to let Honda and Senna have their triumphant coronation, and were one of the few constructors still updating their 1990 cars rather than working on next year's, the updated engine now featuring a butterfly induction for better throttle response. Friday qualifying saw Berger on top and Gasho having a heavy off, but the natural order was resumed on Saturday with Senna taking pole, 2/10 ahead of Prost, with Mansell third ahead of Berger, who was now 1.122 seconds off pole. Boutsen, still complaining about understeer, managed 5th ahead of Piquet. Alesi was 7th and hoping to get further than turn 1 this time, with Patrese alongside. Moreno was a delighted 9th on his Benetton debut, alongside an equally delighted Suzuki 10th in front of his home crowd. Pierluigi Martini put in his usual strong qualifying performance in 11th, Warwick was 12th with Johnny Herbert 15th, just behind the other Japanese driver Nakajima, and Morbidelli was 20th in his first run out for Minardi. With David Brabham happy to make it into the race, the Arrowses and De Cesaris brought up the rear, with the 4 drivers who were spared pre-qualifying, Guiar, Tarquini, Dalmas and Gasho, the 4 to miss out on race day. Every year since its return to the championship, Suzuka had seen the title decided. Mansell's practice crash giving Piquet the 1987 win, Senna triumphing in the reign over Prost in 88, and of course the famous collision between the two the previous year. Just as in Spain 3 weeks earlier, Senna was unhappy at his pole position, being on the dirty side of the track, and argued that pole should always be on the racing line. He and Berger actually went to the Japanese stewards to request the sides be changed, to which they agreed, only for FIA President Jean-Marie Balestre to overrule them. And he wasn't the only one with concerns, particularly after the incident last year, as shown by this Japanese TV footage from the driver's briefing.
The safe thing is, if you miss your chicane, the steward stop you. All right. When have no traffic, let you go. If you have to turn around and go backwards against another car, that's much danger. Because another car comes and miss also, hit forward to you.
That's dangerous.
Okay. Does everybody feel that way?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Huh? I can't stand it. I can't stand this. It's a joke. After what happened last year, it's a joke. This situation. You just prove here. I said nothing, and you see somebody raising the point, and you see everybody agree. And last year was really bad for me. I'm sorry.
Sandro Nannini was well enough on Sunday afternoon to speak to Nelson Piquet on the grid, and was expected to be out of hospital before the Australian Grand Prix, while Jean Alesi had to drop out of the race after having ricked his neck in Friday practice, and it was still giving him discomfort, so for the 3rd time in a row, the field was 25 cars as they lined up under blazing skies for the much-anticipated showdown between Prost and Senna. Away they went, with Prost leaping into the lead from the clean side of the track, but as they came down to the first turn, Senna pulled out and...
Senna is trying to go through on the inside, and it's happened immediately! This is amazing! Senna goes off... And
just like that, Senna was 1990 world champion, and Gerhard Berger was leading Mansell. but only until the start of lap 2 when he skidded off on the dust of his teammates' incident and ended up stranded backwards in the same gravel trap. A short day's work for McLaren, whose failure to score left the Constructors' Championship open, with Ferrari 18 points behind. So now it was Mansell then, at the end of lap 2, with Nelson Piquet right on his tail and a fired-up Moreno right behind his teammate and friend, revelling in his first chance in a really good car. Behind the Benettons were the two Williamses of Boutsen and Patrese, and the low tie of Warwick and Herbert, split by Suzuki's LaRousse Lola. In among all the excitement, everyone had missed Modena being nerfed off by Alio, so there were 4 retirements in the first 2 laps, which became 5 on lap 6 when David Brabham's clutch gave out, making Brabham's weekend almost as short as McLaren's, and on the same lap Gugelmin's engine failed. It was beginning to look like it might be a matter of attrition. Throughout the season, Benetton had usually tried to go the distance on one set of tyres, so Mansell got the hammer down and started to pull away to build a gap to make his own stop and stay in the lead. Lap after lap, Mansell edged away from his old rival Piquet, while Suzuki moved up past Warwick off camera to get into the points, but otherwise things were fairly static as the first half of the race developed. More cars fell by the wayside, as De Cesaris spun off, Capelli's ignition failed, and Morbidelli blotted his Minardi copybook with a spin. Meanwhile, a little further back, 8th place Johnny Herbert was coming under attack from a feisty Nakajima, which the Japanese TV director naturally focused on in lieu of anything particularly interesting happening up front. Boutsen was the first stopper on lap 20 of the Plan 53, a sticking left rear wheel nut keeping him stationary for 13 seconds, and with Warwick also following him in, Suzuki and Herbert moved up into the points, briefly in Johnny's case as he came in soon afterwards. Mansell was now about 8 seconds ahead of Piquet, which wasn't really enough to get a pit stop in, so things would be getting interesting as he would either need to stop and then have to retake the lead, or try and go the distance on his softer C compound tyres, not easy at the abrasive Suzuka circuit. Mansell made his stop on lap 27, almost exactly half distance, and the Ferrari mechanics excelled themselves, changing his tyres in a sniff under 6 seconds. But as Mansell charged away, his car stuttered, made some high-pitched noises, and rolled to a halt, his half-shaft universal joint broken. Cesare Fiorio couldn't believe it, Mansell beat his steering wheel in frustration, and McLaren were Constructors' champions. As Mansell sat disconsolately by the Armco, Piquet and Moreno swept through into the lead. Benetton had benefited from the Senna Prost collision last year, with Sandro Nannini taking a popular maiden win, and it would be a great boost to the team, and Sandro, if they could repeat the feat this year. Patrese was third, having not stopped, but a flying Aguri Suzuki was not just running fourth, but setting fastest lap in the process. With just 12 cars still running and nobody really able to challenge his lead, Piquet had settled back into cruise mode, as Herbert's fine race came to an end with a Lamborghini failure after 31 laps. Nakajima, meanwhile, was again behind a Lotus, this time Derek Warwick, who was occupying the last points-paying position. To a rousing cheer, the Tyrrell swept past along the main straight, as Patrese came in for a late stop on lap 37, which promoted Suzuki into third, and Nakajima into fifth, as Ricciardo was a little slow getting away. So on lap 38 of 53, it was Piquet and Moreno in the lead, with Suzuki third, then Patrese fourth, Boutsen now fifth, and Nakajima down to sixth. Warwick dropped out of 7th with a gearbox failure as the race entered its final stages, and indeed he was the last retirement, leaving 10 cars still running. The remaining 14 laps were fairly uneventful, not that either Roberto Moreno or Aguri Suzuki were complaining. Nelson Piquet came home to take his 21st career win and his first since 1987, ahead of Roberto Moreno, taking a stupendous second place in just his second Grand Prix finish, and Aguri Suzuki a delighted third to become not just the first Japanese driver, but the first Asian of any nationality to stand on a Grand Prix podium. It was Gerard Larousse's first podium as a team owner as well, and Benetton's first 1-2 finish to consolidate third place in the constructors' race over Williams, who trailed in 4th and 5th after a fairly anonymous race, ahead of Satoru Nakajima taking his third points finish of the year for Tyrrell. It had been a good day for Brazil, Senna champion and a 1-2 on the podium, and a fairly good day for Japan, though Honda had now only won one of the 4 Grand Prix held at the track they owned, and the less said of Leighton House footwork and Middlebridge Brabham, the better. Of course, the first corner incident would be all anyone wanted to talk about for some time to come. Senna was interviewed by Ron Dennis after the race and said it was an unfortunate accident.
Ayrton Senna, I've heard that you've recently run the World Championship. Have you got something to say about this?
It's over. I think For sure, I want to win the race today, in the same way I won in '88 to win the championship. Unfortunately, it went wrong on the first corner. There was a big risk. I had nothing to lose on the first corner. I want to win, and I went for a gap in inside on the first corner. Alan didn't see it and just closed the door, and we ended up touching.
While Prost for now at least kept his own counsel. The championships were both decided in as acrimonious and unsatisfying a manner as in 1989, but the 500th Championship Grand Prix in Adelaide was far from a dead rubber. Berger's retirement and Piquet's win had left the race for third place a four-way scrap between those two, Boutsen and Mansell. All three except Gerhard had won races so far, so even equalling his points would take the place. Benetton likewise had put themselves in third place in the constructors' race, but could still lose that place to Williams with a decent result for Frank's boys. But for now, let's hear from Roberto.
Roberto, a dream come true for you. 10 days ago, you didn't even have a car to drive here. You got the Benetton drive and you certainly made the most of it. Fabulous practice and a race performance that was absolutely impeccable.
Well, everything has happened a bit too quick for me, really. Haven't had time to think about everything, but as you said, it just worked fantastic for me. I'm very, very pleased with everybody that gave trust to me and believed that I could probably do something coming here into Adelaide. I'm sorry to disappoint my boss. He wanted me to make 5 points, but only 6 is available. And I just have to thank you, the whole team, because even this morning on the warm-up lap to go into the grid, I had to swap cars and go into the T car. The car was perfect from the start. They tried to do the seat and everything as close as they could to my car. I still had to drive with Nelson's brake pedal that has a lip, which was hurting my foot a little bit every time I brake. But that didn't take me to any mistakes, and luckily I came to the end.